It's a new year, but how can we ensure that it's a new Dolphins in 2025? We're exploring some New Year's resolutions that I would have for some significant members of the organization here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami and the NFL Draft, lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special shout out and welcome to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Start the playoff season with a big return over on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $250 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy 2025. First and foremost, to everybody tuning into the show. Great of you to join me on a New Year's Day. And as the saying goes, new year, new me, right? And that's not necessarily the case for the Miami Dolphins because it's a new year and the Dolphins are in a position to make the postseason with some help and a win on Sunday against the Jets. There's some familiar territory with Tua Tagovailoa is banged up. There's some familiar territory where the offensive line is banged up and really taking away your ability to play a wide menu of offensive football. So I sat down and I came up with some resolutions that I would hope for each of three categories: the hierarchy, the coaching staff, and the players. And I guess my first resolution would go to Stephen Ross, and my resolution would be to not be complacent. And I know a lot of fans have echoed this sentiment and concern of the Dolphins going from 2-6 to 6-2 in their last 8 games, to be at 8-8 and a chance to have a winning season and a chance to make a playoff berth, and what that would mean for this team and the status quo of this team and moving forward into 2025. And I think you do have to, when you sit down and you tally the wins and losses, from a personnel standpoint, from a salary cap standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, there are wins that are not hard to find for this past offseason. And it was the year in which the Dolphins kind of had their draft in surplus ideology from early in this build kind of come to a head, and you had to make decisions on second contracts and decided not to be fiscally irresponsible or overly ambitious and pay everybody all at once. And you let some guys go. And the vacancies left behind are spots that have hurt you in varying degrees. You haven't had answers for everyone that you let go. Some guys you let go were economically feasible to re-sign, and you chose not to anyway. But I think you look at the same issues for multiple seasons now, even if it's for different reasons. The ideology for the offensive line, and we'll talk about that more with Mike McDaniel, but the collection of talent on the roster has put you in continued compromising situation. And it's a finite resource league. There's only so many opportunities you're going to have to add talent. But you look at, you ran out of gas in the pass rush room at the end of the year last year when Bradley Chubb gets hurt and Jaelen Phillips gets hurt. And the moves that were made, thank goodness you did draft Chop Robinson. But pass rush, organic pass rush, sacks and turnovers are the two things defensively that are coming up short in what has otherwise been a pretty strong season for the Dolphins defense, at least from a number of metrics, whether that's third down or red zone or scoring defense or total yards, whatever it may be. They're pretty well represented, with the exception of turnovers and sacks. The offensive line. And, last year it was injuries where primary backups played more snaps than the starters in 4 out of 5 spots. This year you didn't necessarily have that to the same degree, but Austin Jackson missed the second half of the season with an injury. Teron Armstead has been intermittently in and out of the starting lineup. The guards that you had last year, one was coming off of a season-ending injury and didn't play until week 16, and the other one signed a $20 million per year contract in Carolina, and that was the one spot you really didn't make any effort to replace. And Rob only played 500 snaps for the team last year, but the 500 snaps that he played versus the 500 that you've gotten out of the half of body of work for Liam at right guard this year, it's a very different kind of player, right? So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but my message to Stephen Ross would be the central themes here. You probably at a point, regardless of whether the team finishes 8-9, if they'd have finished 6-11, if they finished 9-8 with a wild card berth, no matter what, take an assessment of your product and your team and your franchise and decide where there needs to be a change, because I do think there does need to be some level of a shakeup and new input by just continuing to work within the confines of who's here and who's been here and working together. I'm not saying you got to flush house. And I don't necessarily think cleaning house at this stage with where the team is at is probably the best idea. But I do think getting new input with somebody, if you go through a process and you find somebody that you really are taken to, can be very valuable in the efforts to take the plateau that you've been pressed up against for the last 3 seasons and find opportunities with new ideas from new people to push through it. And I am, of course, largely talking about, I think the general manager spot is the spot where, and I've generally been pro the job Chris Grier has done, and I understand that misses in the draft are an inevitability. But when you look at where the misses have happened and the way that they've added up, and at the end of the day, the name that goes at the bottom of every roster transaction that happens for this team is the man in charge of football operations, and that's Chris. So my resolution for Stephen Ross is do not let a strong finish allow you to be totally complacent or content with the excuses and the context, even if the context is legitimate. And in some ways it is legitimate. But at some point, you continuing to put yourself in the positions where legitimate reasons for not being successful continue to happen to you. What's the central theme there? And that's why I go down the rabbit hole and talking about personnel decisions in the pass rush room and personnel decisions on the offensive line. And if this team has a healthy offensive line, it's got a darn good offensive line, but this team is not healthy. And they did not upgrade the 2 spots that they had at left guard and right guard last year. They literally let Rob Hunt walk and ran back the other top 3 guys. So my resolution for Stephen Ross is to have proper perspective in not just the low-hanging fruit of the last 2 months, but rather look at the entirety of the Chris Grier, Mike McDaniel experience and ask yourself, how do you get through that glass ceiling? Yeah, because we are living in a world where the Dolphins can win against the Jets on Sunday, regardless of what happens from help with Denver. And you'd be looking at 5 consecutive winning seasons. This team hasn't done that in forever. There's only a handful of teams that could say that. And the Dolphins are in position to do that. But is that what the objective was? And on one hand, yes, the objective was to build a sustained winner that is going to be in contention every single year. But being in contention without having the breakthrough loses you a little bit of the grace that comes with understanding you're not going to win the Super Bowl every single year. Right? So, Mr. Ross, that's my resolution for you. Get to the end of this season and assess honestly what the central themes are and why this team has not found the opportunity to take the next step. And then the same thing I ask for Mike McDaniel with the players and from the players themselves as this team is struggling to a 2-6 start. Identify where there needs to be accountability for it. Because I think the nucleus of this group is still quite strong. And they are coming into another opportunity where they have established talent and established contract, and they're going to be able to start to add again starting this year, depending on what they choose to do. Make it count, but make it count. Make sure you have the right people to make it count now that you're coming into another investment window to build upon the nucleus and foundation of the team. We're going to do Mike McDaniel and what I hope for him next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Make sure that you stick with us. NFL fans, you can make the most of this final stretch before the playoffs. It's not too late to get in on some regular season sports action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. FanDuel has so many ways for you to pick up a win, whether that's player props, touchdowns, game totals, team totals, you name it. Visit FanDuel.com to join today. At FanDuel.com for your chance for $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Entering into Week 18 with Tua Tagovailoa's status still in flux. Miami favored on the road by 1.5 against the New York Jets. If you like the Jets, and if you like the Jets regardless, you might want to hold out on putting a money line bet on, because in the event that Tua Tagovailoa does play in this game, I always imagine this spread goes up, and by extension, the money line payouts would be greater for a Jets upset. But if you like the Dolphins to win the game, the odds are probably never going to be as good as what you could get right now for the money line if you wanted to jump on that as well. So give some consideration there over at FanDuel. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more. Mike McDaniel. I have a couple of resolutions for Mike McDaniel. I think the first one is parallel to the one that we had for Stephen Ross, which is identify the central themes of struggles across 3 seasons. And there's a couple different areas that I look at, and I don't know what your process is for deciding how to challenge plays. But what I do know is your process for challenging plays has not led to very many successful challenges at all. I would look at, what is the process that leads to 4 successful challenges in 18 attempts in 50 games? And some of those, I understand there's a very little risk. It's still a timeout situation. So you might as well get the review to go with the timeout and talk about what's going to happen on the other side of it, and maybe you get a lucky break. I get that. Not all challenges that don't succeed are bad challenges. But you've had some challenges that just never stood a chance. And it was like, why not? Right? For Mike McDaniel, look at your short yardage issues. Ask yourself, have an honest question about what kind of personnel changes need to be made for your short yardage issues to be amended. And by extension of that, I think there is a philosophical pillar that Mike's brought with him from the other stops with the other coaches that have been a part of this tree, and everybody's kind of navigated that independently in their own way, in their own stops. But stopgap guards are not viable, particularly with an offense that benefits from being balanced and benefits from having more ability to run the ball, to take the ball or take less hits on the quarterback. And I know the quarterback does his job, and we'll talk about the quarterback in segment 3. But there's been some alarming regression in terms of yards per attempt. You were 19th in year 1. You were first in the league in yards per attempt in year 2, and you're 31st this year in yards per attempt. And your attempts, you rank 17th in the league in attempts this year as compared to 15th last year. At least in 2022, you didn't run the ball because you knew you couldn't really run the ball. But now you can't run the ball, and you still try to run the ball, and that's in part because you lost your backup quarterback for an extended stretch of time and are now in the midst of potentially finishing the season without your starting quarterback. So I would hope at some point 50, 51 plus 2 playoff games would be 52, 53, maybe 54 if you make the playoffs and play another playoff game. Like, the sample size here is big enough to look at what you believe and what your ideology was that you applied to the team when you first got here and start to adjust and tweak. And if you can do that, I think the ability of your team to craft winning game plans against opponents that understand what you're trying to do to them and they choose to take that away, and you really don't have anything else at your disposal, so you try to continue to coach and scheme your way around it. That's usually when games get away from Miami. It's a good defensive coaching staff has a beat on what Miami is trying to do to them offensively, and they're well prepared for it, and they have success dissuading it. And it's like your pathway to victory is very singular because of the ideology of how you've constructed and built this team. So in part, that's part of why I think from Stephen Ross's perspective, Mike McDaniel, I'm under the assumption Mike McDaniel's safe, and Mike McDaniel's going to be back next year. And I'm totally fine with that. You know, if you felt like there was a coach out there that you were head over heels for that was going to address some of the other issues at hand that we experienced with Mike McDaniel, okay. But don't make the change just for the sake of making a change. I think it's a little easier from Stephen Ross's perspective with the general manager and the executive, the team, because you can make that personnel and football operations change without totally changing the culture of what you want the process to look like to run the team and have operations, because you still have Tom Garfinkel, you still have Brandon Shore, you still have the head coach of the team. I just want a different voice to foil, and Chris, by title, has had since 2019. And some of the issues, whether it was because of Brian Flores and Brian Flores couldn't put together an offensive staff, or whether it was because Mike McDaniel and Mike McDaniel's ideology of how to build a team and what was important and what was not, no matter what, like that process and then its sample size is big enough. You're through 6 years. And then if you include the 3 years that Chris had with title, even if he wasn't the final say in everything, you're talking 9 years. So that's for me where there's a lot of good things that are done with that spot. Mike McDaniel has plenty of appeal. The players like him. I think sometimes that, and another resolution that I would have for Mike is to continue to have hard conversations. And he's alluded to hard conversations this season with his players and his coaches. But there's been players that have not played to performance and have continued to get opportunities to play. And that started to change this year when you consider Liam Eichenberg is effectively benched, but not really benched for Isaiah Wynn. David Long in that situation, the Odell Beckham situation. I applaud the willingness to act on player performance or player vibes or player that not necessarily great fits for how the team is playing out in any individual season, and say, hey, you know what, we're going to let somebody else do it. Because that really hasn't been a thing for Mike. I think more of it is good and more of it is necessary. It's not always comfortable being a leader. And I know Mike likes to defer to his players because it's their locker room to be the leaders on the team. And I think that is a fine stance to take. But as the head coach, in the same way that the executive is ultimately responsible for every personnel decision the team makes, every personnel game day decision or playing time decision or the locker room culture as a whole, the man in charge of that as the head coach, ultimately that falls at his feet. And there's been some of that this year for Miami that I think if you're going to take this team where it wants to go and address some of the perceptions around this team, that has a kind of an alarming body of work or an alarming sample size that would justify it, then you probably need to continue to be more hands-on with the players from a leadership perspective. So those are things for me with Mike McDaniel that I would have as resolutions for Mike, to make sure that he's the best version of himself for the locker room that he possibly can be to give the Dolphins the best possible product that they can have. How about some of the players? I have a few player-led resolutions, and we're going to get into them next here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Lots of exciting action this weekend, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football. It's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats with like passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, whether you're looking for a flex play or to boost your payout, or you want to win cash quickly. Prize Picks has you covered with over 10 million members and billions in winnings. It's clear that people love using the platform. Here's a special offer for Locked On listeners. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Prize Picks. Run your game. Download the Prize Picks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL. Get $50 instantly after you play that first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. New Year's resolution number 1. And it's for Tua Tagovailoa. And as much as I want to say, just slide when you consider where he's gotten banged up this year and the body of work that he has going back to Alabama, the vast majority of the injuries that he has taken has been on stuff trying to create plays where there are not necessarily plays to be made. I said this last February, and I would not dispute that the work that Tua Tagovailoa put in this offseason to be a more fluid and agile player, to expand his ability to create outside of structure, it worked, but at what cost? And unfortunately, with a concussion that was very easily avoidable, you lost 4 games there. And then you're scrambling against the Texans and you finish that game, and then you play the 49ers game, but you take another hit, so it's kind of aggravated, and then it didn't heal as fast as they wanted to. So then you miss the Browns game. We'll see what happens with the Jets. But that also happened on a play outside the pocket. So habitually, these incidences of taking the kind of hits that remove you from games almost always happen on extended plays. And to be the best version of himself, I get it. That element, if it's there, you can be the best version of yourself. But the best version of yourself is the one who's on the field for 17 games. I'd put some of the weight back on. I'd put the body armor back on. Knowing full well that I can't move around as much. And I know he alluded to in the press conference when he was asked about it, competitive greatness. And he trying to compete to make plays and be great. And I respect it, and I admire the fact that he is so unwavering in it. But when they set a plan last year, and the plan was to be durable and last the season and put the armor on and learn how to fall, they did it. And then he learned, and then it was, I want to cut some of the weight so I can move and play outside of structure more. They did it. But the cost of that to me is not worth it. I would rather have less appeal outside of structure and try to build the rest of your roster to complement what you do well, so you don't have to do that as much. Like, heaven forbid, we do have an offensive line that can get up and consistently create push on the line of scrimmage. That would be, is take some of the stress and put it into a more balanced attack. And when you consider where the Dolphins are at in the NFL from a passing perspective, they're 9th in the NFL in attempts per game. They were 20th in 2023 because they were able to run the ball, and they were 15th in attempts, but first in yards per attempt, first in explosive plays, 6th in yards. So they were able to be 20th in pass attempts. 2 in 11 games has, and not even 11 full games, has what, 399 pass attempts this season? You go back to last season when he played in all 17 games, he had 560. So you're talking 161 more attempts in an extra 6 games at this, depending on if he plays in the Week 18 game or not. That kind of volume of throwing the ball at that rate if you're more complimentary in what you're trying to do and what your player is, and you know your quarterback's not really an outside of structure guy, so hey, maybe we should win more frequently on 1st and 10 and 2nd and long with our ability to run the ball. And you saw the Rams have done this, right? The Rams embodied the powerful in between the tackles, guards, and center. And I think Aaron Brewer's an outstanding player and a great scheme fit. And you don't have to get rid of Aaron Brewer to bulk up your guards. But your guards, you saw it against Cleveland. Every guard involved, the ability to create knockback at the point of attack to allow your inside the tackle runs to hit with consistency, it just wasn't where it needs to be. I'm not saying you got to go out and sign Trey Smith for $23 million per season and draft a first-round guard with the other spot. It's not that hard. But that's where you reflect on Liam and Rob Jones, and they're really not even fits for the scheme that you want to run. They're just guys that had time on task. So Tua, take care of what you need to take care of for yourself to be in a position to play all 16 games, and then that's where I would put the rest of the pressure on the Dolphins to have the right plan this offseason to make sure that there's not too much emphasis on outside of structure as a necessity, and instead let's build upon what we have. And now you have 3 different iterations of the offense that you can lean into depending on whatever kind of personnel you end up landing on to work with. So that would be my Tua resolution would be, I would want more body armor on my body this year than last year, or this next year than this year, even at the expense of outside of structure stuff. Let's see. Chop Robinson, keep working on your run fits, because man, we're on the fast track here. The second half of the season for you has been phenomenal. Continue to diversify your pass rush outside counter plans, and be ready, because you are going to have an opportunity to be an outstanding football player for the Dolphins for a really long time. Calais Campbell, come to the offseason with an open mind. Would not be mad to see you back with this football team again next year. Jaelen, Phillips, Bradley Chubb, rest up, get ready. But the big player one for me is definitely Tua Tagovailoa. Now, Jalen Wright, as a player that I think has the skill set that can really help you, that can allow you to kind of get the right body types in the right situation. That for me would be another one, is Jalen Wright to work on the reps and the film and the feel of pressing the line of scrimmage and making the right cuts, so that this coaching staff can trust you to be the player that you're capable of being for different kinds of runs. Right? Devon Achane gets so much run as an every down player, when in reality his body type is very much tailored towards a specific kind of usage. Devon Achane this year has 192 carries. He's got 270 touches. He's already got more than twice as many touches as he had last season. And that's coming with, from a snap count perspective, he's probably going to go over 700 snaps in the Week 18 game against the Jets. He played 300 snaps in 2023. He's ideally a player that's probably playing 500 snaps. Or if he's going to be on the field for 700, he's not getting the ball, running the ball 200 plus times and averaging 12 and a half carries per game. So that's a little bit less on Devon Achane, because I think he is who he is. And I think it's a little bit more on Jalen Wright as the player that the team invested in, to be prepared to take the role that the team probably saw when they made him the pick. We'll see what else comes our way. But that's going to do it for this episode, this New Year's Day episode of Locked on Dolphins. We have Locked on crossover with Locked on Jets and John Butchko tomorrow to get you guys ready. We kind of go big picture as compared to looking at the game itself. We do get into the game itself, but we look big picture with the Jets, obviously with GM and head coach openings. Miami, obviously with the Tua Tagovailoa saga continuing onward, and we really don't have any clarity at this point in time on what that's going to look like. So we touch on all of that, and we hope to see you then. I'm Kyle Krabs. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Make it a good one. Happy New Year.